Good morning. This is just a little quick art update. As I've mentioned before, the craft that I'm making for the State Fair is a little book which depicts an alien St. Patrick's Day parade. Well, actually, I only have two more pages left in that story. It's in the separate sketchbook, and I'm going to try and paint them today. So this will be my task. But I just want to take a minute to go through the next chapter in this book, which is the history of comic strips. And what's kind of interesting is this is the chapter that covers World War II. Is that in many ways the stories of comics has already come to an end. A lot of the classic comic strips are really born from the 1930s. Flash Gordon, Little Orphan Annie, Dick Tracy, Lil Abner, and the like. So in some ways, World War II is kind of a strange interlude because dozens and dozens of comic strips appear and just last for a year, 2 years, maybe the length of the war, and then they disappear. Moreover, many comic strip artists did extra strips for the newspapers for the soldiers or war bond strips. So much in this chapter is basically a digression from the story of the comic strip, because obviously Tyrian pirates is important, but just a lot of this just didn't last. It was just kind of a temporary little blip. All of these stories of secret agents, we think of that as James Bond, but really that starts here in the comics and other things, pulp really, from the 1940s. Hitchcock's films of the 1950s really come out of these comics. That's not in this book, that's just sort of an observation. So we just have dozens and dozens of these comics, which I have never heard of, and they just lasted for a year. I mean, here's one about a war refugee. Here we have Dick Tracy selling war bonds. Al Cap of Lil Abner fame, he did a comic just to sell war bonds, essentially. Um, I think this one, Penny, had a really interesting art style. I will have to look that up one day. I mean, this is basically a whole little ecosystem that sprang into being and then disappeared. Barnaby looks really interesting. I think this is also a strip that I would like to research. But anyway, we get through the war years, and we get to the late 40s and late early 50s, and then here, I already know we're going to start coming into basically the next generation of cartoonists. We're going to get to Charles Schultz. We're going to get Pogo. Al Cap's going to become really famous. The 1950s is sort of another era of comics, but in some ways it's a golden era, but in other ways it's not, because the artists were given a lot less space to work with. So in many ways the 1930s were the highlight of that time period. And of course, comic books were coming into their own and becoming their own medium, separate. I just want to spend a moment to mention the passing of Steve Ditko. He passed away a few days ago, and this is, of course, irrelevant. Here we have an artist who co-created Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and many others, and in many ways, I was very saddened by his passing. Not necessarily that he passed as an old man, but he died alone, and his body was discovered days later, and I wish he had received more of the public acclaim. I didn't even hear about his death till a week later, and then I had heard about it, but then regular news outlets didn't talk about it till a week after that, so it seems like just now people are talking about his passing. And Ditko was not a perfect man, and there were certainly some mistakes he made, I suppose, and there are ways that he could have received more credit. But the point is, as I've been researching the history of the comic strip and the comic book, the people who actually create these have often not received the respect or attention that they deserved in life. We saw that when Pulitzer and Hearst were feuding with their cartoonists 125 years ago. Later on, we can talk about Charles Schulz having troubles with the syndicate. Obviously, Bill Watterson. In the comic book world, we can talk about Kirby and Ditko, and many others. It's a very sad thing. And I will leave you with a final bit here. We also have some current events. There's a sort of a how to describe this? Sort of a popular uprising against DC and Disney Marvel. It is called Comicsgate, and Comicsgate seems to mean different things to different people. It has a political dimension to it. It it's very hard to summarize because it's not a single thing. It's not a single movement. It's a popular movement, and so it is multifaceted. But I do want to point out one element which I don't think is quite being discussed so much is that it is also a revolt of the artists and creators against constraints. A lot of artists want to create what they want to create. A lot of writers, a lot of creators, they don't want to be tied down in the way that, for instance, Steve Ditko was tied down. For instance, the way that these other artists that I've been discussing before, 125 years ago, in the way that they were forced to conform to a certain mold. Now, Comicsgate means many different things, and some are little perhaps unsavory, perhaps some of it is a little reactionary, but it is an interesting development, and perhaps we can discuss that later, since it is a new development. Although I will probably mostly be discussing the history of things, because that is what can be known more clearly. Anyway, I will keep you informed as to my painting progress. I hope to finish those 2 pages today, and then tomorrow I hope to start painting in the 3rd and final sketchbook for this summer. Goodbye.